And now we finally come to part 3, Politics in the Gilded Age, as we look at the end of America's Gilded Age, 1870 to 1890. So we've already talked a lot about the Gilded Age, and that this is a period where the people at the very, very top, the gilt, G-I-L-T, at the top, is getting very, very rich. They're doing very, very well. But the rest of society isn't doing all that well. And so there is widespread unease over the effects of corporate lobbyists who are in there, like they are right now, trying to get more and more and more money for the corporations, to have less restrictions, less regulations, less taxes. In other words, give them free rein. Also, the even more upsetting to the rank and file, I think, at this particular moment, is what we refer to as the political machines. Now, these are establishments in large cities. These are attached to the parties. These are the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are the two primary parties by this point. And in major cities across the United States, you have precincts. Just as you do here, you have precincts, and within those precincts, the party bosses often held tremendous sway. They would work with local businesses, they would work with local charities, and so if your husband was out of work and your children were starving, there was no government assistance, and so you would go to one of the party bosses and you would say, look, my kids are starving, my husband's out of work, he needs a job, we don't have any food in the house, and he would then fill out a couple of notes, hand them to you and say, take this to Catholic Charities and they'll give you some foods, have your husband take this to this address on the dock and they'll give him a job. And it was always understood that, of course, the reason that they're doing this is that then you will support the slate of tickets by that party in that next election. And so really it's a way of using influence to buy votes. I think the reason that we still solidly have the two parties that we have is that this is where everything was stamped at the end of the Civil War. The parties have switched places. In the South, the former Democrats have all become Republicans and vice versa. And so there is a switch. But the coming out of the Civil War and up into the 20th century, in the South, you have the Democrats are the party of Jim Crow. They're the party of lynching. In the North, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are closely aligned with corporations and large business. And both parties rely on using regional emphases to promote bases in those areas. So in the South, of course, the Democrats are heavily pushing for the white vote. Republicans in the South at this point are doing what they can where they can to try to drum up other votes, although most of the time they just ignore the South and let the Democrats continue to hold it. But they use regional issues to kind of lock in their votes in specific regions across the country. Both parties kind of defer to business interests. What's good for business is good for the country. It was kind of the mantra at the time. We do start to see, though, a few things change. The first one of these is the Civil Service Act, and what this was intended to do, and it still works to a certain degree, is it was to take the government out of the hands of politicians. Used to be, new president would get elected and essentially every federal employee would be fired on the spot, and then you would put in all of the people who had voted for you, even down to the areas of the local postmaster or the local justice of peace. These would all be put in by the parties, and so you had control pretty much all the way down. This meant that every 4 years or every 8 years, but on a somewhat regular basis, new people would be brought into these jobs. And many of these jobs require experience. And so, just as had been done in ancient China a couple of millennia ago, there was this belief that if you had a permanent civil servant class, a group of people who were outside of politics. They might have their own individual politics, but they do the job regardless of who's in power. and the jobs become separated from political ideologies, then you can have a much stronger, much more robust, and much more efficient bureaucracy. And so the Civil Service Act is actually put in to fix this particular problem. And one of the easiest examples of this, of course, is if you want to go to work at the post office. You got to take the civil service exam. You got to pass it, and then you get put into the queue. And regardless of your educational background, regardless of your race, or your ethnicity, or your gender, when your number comes up, you get hired. Another act that's passed by Congress at this point we refer to as the Interstate Commerce Act, and this solidifies some of the stuff that's in the Constitution and some of the earlier laws that basically say that once goods or services cross a state line, then federal law trumps. And that's essentially what this law says, is that if you sell across state lines, you have to abide by the laws in both states. That sometimes poses some interesting issues. And then the Sherman Antitrust Act was an early attempt at breaking up some of the big monopolies. We have the monopolies we have today are monstrous compared to the monopolies that the Sherman Antitrust Act was trying to break up. They would be baby monopolies compared to the ones that we have today. The discussion, the debate over the role of states can really... It never goes away. This continues. We have this argument when we're writing the Declaration of Independence. We have this argument when we're writing the Constitution. This is the argument that creates the Civil War. And the one thing that the Civil War does do is it does solidify and it clarifies, in one sense, the role of the states to the federal government, but not completely. We call our territories, or our provinces, states, because the original 13 under the Articles of Confederation, which predate the Constitution and were a huge failure, they were 13 individual countries. And the definition of the word state is a country. Mexico is the only other country in the world that calls their territories states, Estados Unidos de Mexico. However, excuse my pronunciation. However, they just copied us. They formed 100 years after we did, and they just used the same nomenclature that we had, and so they labeled their states. But here in this country, they were separate countries. The Articles of Confederation is thrown away in the late 1890s and replaced by the Constitution. And from that point until the Civil War, we referred to the United States as these United States. In other words, they were states and they were united, much as the European Union is today. Nobody would think that France and Germany, both in the EU, are the same country. They remain separate states. And that was the original plan here. We get the Constitution, there's the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, and the whole discussion going on that gives us the Bill of Rights at the ratification of the Constitution. But essentially the discussion continued as to whether we were a single country with individual provinces or whether we were individual countries united at the federal level. And that ends with the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, we often refer to this country as these United States. After the Civil War, we refer to this country as the United States. In other words, it is a single country. But the role of government at the state, local, and federal levels continues to be an issue. We often talk about nullification crises, where a state will pass a law that is contrary to federal law. And if you're opposed to that law, you'll go, hey, that is completely out of the scope of what a state can do. Yeah, the federal law has to trump. If, on the other hand, you like the law, then you use the notion that, oh, well, the states are the the proving ground or the laboratory for national policy. So Kansas goes on an austerity binge. They use trickle-down economics. The economy of the state collapses. Then they go and try to implement it at the national level. That's actually what's going on at the time I'm recording this lecture. It may be the case by the time you hear it, or it may be completely gone. But essentially, that we will practice things in the states and then apply them on the federal level. Like I said, if we disagree with it, then it's nullification and the states are wrong. If we agree with it, then like I said, we refer to it as the laboratory of the states. So, for example, California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, a number of states have legalized either medical and or recreational marijuana. That, by definition, should be trumped by federal law, which keeps marijuana as a type 1, a class 1 narcotic, and completely illegal to own or to sell or to use or whatever. So when it's something we like, we go, oh, well, it's an experiment. When it's something we don't like, it's a nullification crisis. In addition, we begin to see protest. We begin to see social movements. We begin to see marches in the streets. We begin to see a variety of ideas coming up from the grassroots. Now, the definition of the grassroots is that it's something that starts at the bottom. It's usually external to political parties, might cross party lines, might not fit into either party or any party, and generally these are issue driven. Whether it's, you see a lot of this today, whether it's the Women's March or whether it's marches against eliminating net neutrality or things like that. And we see a present that reflects this past of grassroots protest and grassroots development. Each age in American history views the concept of freedom differently. I often ask my students the question, what does land of the brave and home of the free, or land of the free and home of the brave, what does that mean? Does it have any meaning? What is freedom? And if this were a face-to-face class, or if we were in class right now, I would ask the class, what is your definition of freedom? And most students in the class say, well, I'm free, I live in America. And I'll ask you, well, what do those freedoms entail? And they'll almost always go to economic freedom. So I have the freedom to succeed or to fail. Statistically, that's not true. You have the freedom to maybe end up a little bit better off than your parents, but that's about it. Historically and statistically, and the likelihood of you becoming the next Rockefeller or the next Trump is completely non-existent. The definitions of words like freedom and brave, they are vague deliberately so that I can have a definition, you can have a definition, your classmates can have a different definition. We all agree that freedom is good, even though we disagree on what it means to be free. I might think that freedom would be not having to worry about medical bills and paying for college. You might think that freedom has to do with you can start a business and have the freedom to fail or succeed. It depends on what you define as freedom to be. But by leaving it so vague and so open, that kind of leaves everything open for interpretation. And the same is true here. And so there are lots and lots of discussions going on around the country and actually around the world as the second industrial age waves is coming across. How do we deal with these changes in society? How do we deal with these inequalities? How do we deal with people at the lower levels? Do we bring them up? Do we shut them out? And so here in this country, there are a number of ideas that are being viewed as addressing these issues. One of the first is just to say that we're a meritocracy. If you're rich, it's because God wanted you to be rich. If you're poor, it's because of some defect. And that we still have that strain of thought going through our society today. It is a very conservative, very right-wing philosophy that usually is perpetuated by those that have against those that are the have-nots. You very seldom will hear a very poor person, you will hear some, but you very seldom will hear a poor person say, you know what, I've got to take care of the estate tax. Because at the current state, unless they've repealed it by the time you've heard this, the current state of the estate tax is you have to leave an estate of $10 million or more for anybody to have to pay a penny of tax on it. But if you can convince a poor person, oh, we got to get rid of the estate tax because that means I won't be able to pass on my double wide, then you can get the support. And there is a fear in the Gilded Age that what if in a democracy the lower classes rose up? Now in the South they've already solved this problem by disenfranchising African Americans, even though under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment they are citizens and they have the right to vote. Those rights are stripped from them, and it would take until much later before many of the residents of the South are given those votes or reclaim those votes. But in the North, there's a fear of immigrants. There's a fear of non-citizens. There's a fear that what happens if those lower classes rise up? They outnumber the rich, right? The rich have the money, but you have a vote. And everyone in this class, 18 years of age or older that's a citizen, has a vote. And what if they actually exercise that? Luckily for the wealthy and for the elite in the United States, less than 25% generally vote in any election. You look at democracies around the world, turnout is 60, 70, 80%. You look at the United States, it's 20, 25, 30 on a really hot one. The majority of us don't exercise our freedoms. We let other people decide how our society will look. We let other people decide what our priorities are. We've gotten very, very complacent. As long as we can download all the porn and all of the kitty pictures that we can find, we're in great shape. As long as the water runs out of the tap, which in the last few years there have been places here in the valley where the water hasn't run, and those people are starting to go, wait a minute, where's my freedom? But as long as the water comes out of the tap, most of you will sit on your butt. One of the grad programs I was in when I was working on my Ph.D. was up in San Francisco, a strange little place. But every day the professor would come in, she'd look around the room, and she would say, why are you here? Why are you not in the streets? What is it that makes you so complacent that you can't see what's going on around you? And this is what the liberal reformers of the late 1890s feared, was that the rank and file, the people in the streets, the people in the slums, the people in the middle class housing, the people in public schools, that they would start saying, you know what? That's a pretty big pie. How come I've got such a little piece of it? And so there is a fear of them rising up. And so how we define freedom becomes important. And we begin pushing this notion of property rights, which is what this country is based on. 23 separate provisions of the Constitution are about property rights. Most of those, the right to own humans as property, but that's for another class. But if we push this notion of, you know what, you're free, you're an individual, you don't need the rest of these people, you don't need to rely on your neighbor, you get yours. You grab your property, you hang on to it, and you don't give it to anybody. This is also the period in history where two thoughts, and I only put Darwin on the slide, but we also should talk about Freud, but two areas of science have entered the public imagination. And the first one is Freudian psychology, so everybody wants to sleep with their mother or their father or play with their poo. That's one side. the other side is the Darwin side. And there's this notions that springs out of a misunderstanding of how evolution works. And it gets referred to as social Darwinism. It gets survival of the fittest, not a term that Darwin originally used. It was a term that was developed by a guy named Spencer, who was the head of the eugenics movement, which was a human breeding program that led to the forced sterilization of millions of people here in the United States because they weren't sufficiently smart or the right color or the right class, or they were criminal or they were stupid or they were whatever. And this notion that we are a meritocracy, we'll use that term again, that if you work hard, you'll get rich. Well, the hardest working people I know are farm workers, and I don't see any of them moving up to North Fresno and buying 6,000 square foot houses. I see the people that employ them, the ones that sit on their butts in the office. But I don't actually see the people working hard getting rich. This is actually a huge lie. It is a lie that is perpetuated by the notion that if you work hard, you can make it. And that's to keep you working hard rather than investing, or rather than looking for other ways, or rather than looking at other forms, other economic forms, or other political forms. This is also the period where unions begin to become important, and so there is an attempt, and pretty efficient, to negate unions. And one of these is the liberty of contract, this notion that you don't want to have to contract with your coworkers because they're a bunch of lazy sods. I want to negotiate just with you. You're my best worker. And I'm going to give you what's fair for you. And if I give what's fair to you to everybody, then I can't afford it. I can't afford to pay you what you're worth and everyone else what they're worth. So I'll pay you what they're worth and I'll pay them what they're worth rather than what you're worth. That's the notion. Now, of course, the problem is that an individual has almost no power when negotiating that contract. There is usually on the factory floor another worker just as skilled, just as proficient, just as willing to work hard, and willing to do it for maybe less. And so this notion of liberty of contract, the idea of the sacredness of the contract between the employer and the individual employee, is pushed at the end of the 19th century as a way to slow down the growth of unions. And as I said, this is set up in such a way so that basically it's between you and me. It's our contract. The government can't say anything about it. The public can't say anything about it. Your coworkers can't say anything about it. And this is a very pro-business era. And you see here a whole list, and I don't want to go through all of these, but there's a whole long list of court cases that either overturn regulatory legislation or distort it in such a way that it no longer has any power. And so even though there are attempts to regulate the abuses of large businesses, most of the time the atmosphere in the country, especially those that are in power, whether it's the courts, whether it's Congress, whether it's the White House, are pretty much pro-business, anti-regulation, anti-union. And we see this in the popular press. Here you see a political cartoon from the turn of the century, from a magazine called Puck. And here it is. This is your Senate. And who owns the Senate? Well, they're back in the gallery. There's the Steel Trust. There's the Copper Trust. There's Standard Oil. There's the Iron Workers Trust, the Sugar Trust. It just keeps going on. And in front of that, you see the members of the Senate turning to their bosses to see how it is they're supposed to vote and legislate. They turn to their bosses. Now, we live in exactly this same period today with the corporate lobbyists and the large corporations, and with many people in both the Senate and the House, as well as in the administrations, going back and forth between the businesses that they regulate and heading the businesses that the government is supposed to be regulating. And so you see this marriage between business and government. Really, the first big national awareness of the quote-unquote labor question is a huge railroad strike in 1877. And there are a couple of other factors around this time. The railroad strike is one of the ugliest strikes. There's a great deal of sabotage. There's a lot of damage, and this plays into the narrative that these are anarchists. They don't want. They're not looking out for you. They only want to cause damage, etc., etc. One of the earliest labor unions that was inclusive was referred to as the Knights of Labor, and this is a unique labor movement at this particular time because most of the burgeoning labor unions that exist are exclusive. They don't allow immigrants. They only allow males. They only allow skilled workers. Knights of Labor are much more inclusive, and they include black workers. They include farmers. They include Jewish workers. And much of the labor movement at this particular time is attacking things like social Darwinism and the liberty of the contract. They are really, as factories continue to develop and less skill is needed for factory jobs, and workers are more and more exploitable because they don't need to have all that extra training and skill and experience. There begins to become a loss of economic independence. If I can take you out of this factory and drop you into that factory, and they make, one makes widgets and one makes squidgies, but they're completely different products, but all you need to do is one skill, it really doesn't matter. And so you become less valuable because you are interchangeable. And this perpetuates that huge inequality of wealth and power, which the unions are trying to go against. Let's talk about the redistribution of wealth. And since 1980s, we redistributed wealth upwards. That's why we have the huge inequalities. This was an attempt to redistribute wealth downward, which is what we will again do in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and then we do the switch in the 80s. And they also, as some groups point out today, they point out that democracy is really corrupted by concentrated capital, by having so much money in the hands of so few. That gives them a huge voice. You and I don't have the ability to sit down and have dinner with our senator. But I guarantee you that the bosses at Google get to sit down with Nancy Pelosi and with Kamala Harris anytime they want. And so this is another carryover of this particular period of our history. A moment ago I mentioned the railroad strike. This is actually one of the rail yards. I believe this is in Chicago. This is part of that 1877 railroad strike, where this is the result of sabotage. Striking workers went in and pretty much destroyed everything they could find in the train yard. However, this is also a period of reform, the beginnings of reform. And what we have, as we come to the turn of the century, we have a growing middle class, a very small but growing middle class. These are the white-collar workers in those factories. And most of these are male. Some of them are female, but most of these are male. Most of these have families. Right? This middle class is being developed here at the turn of the century, and it's coming out of the factory system. These aren't the guys on the factory floor wearing blue collars because they can get sweaty and dirty. These are the ones in the offices in white collars. And one of the things that that middle class strives for is the accoutrement of the class above them. In other words, luxury goods that are now becoming consumer goods because they're made much cheaper, much more accessible. And so things that 10 years ago, 15 years ago were unavailable, now they can afford and they can have them, and they're just as nice as what the wealthy had a few years ago. In addition, they make enough money that the woman usually doesn't have to work. And they also make enough money so that the woman gets help in the home. Right up through the 1960s, especially in the South, but pretty much across the board, around the country, middle-class families had live-in help. Or if not live-in, at least help that came in every day or every other day. These could be housekeepers, they could be nannies, they could be a combination, they could be maids, they could be butlers, whatever. So the middle class, especially the upper middle class, but the middle class is hiring lots and lots of people to come and work for them. Okay, now what that does, and the reason why this is important, is that frees up the white-collar housewives. And many of these women are very religious. Many are Protestants. There's also a large group of Catholics as well, but most of these are Protestant. And they have a lot of free time. And their understanding of religion is that Jesus said to take care of the poor. And they see a lot of poor. Jesus said it was harder for a rich man to get in heaven than for a camel to get through the eye of a needle. And we got a lot of rich people. And so these white middle-class women begin to become really the new face of reformers. These are the women who will bring about prohibition. These are the women who will fight for women's rights. These are the women who will fight for compulsory education, for more park space in the large cities. In other words, to try to improve the situations in the cities. Margaret Sanger founds Planned Parenthood at this time, partly because the poorer classes are still having too many babies. When you were a farmer in Ukraine, you had 6 to 10 kids because a couple of them are going to die, and you need the labor. The little ones pick up the eggs and feed the chickens. The next one's up, do the milking, and the others work in the fields. And that's how you run a farm. But when you come to America and you move to New York City and you live in a tiny little 2-room cold water flat, that family of 12 is just a burden. You can't afford to educate those children. That means they have to go to work. Child labor laws haven't really kicked in yet. Children are still able to work in factories where they get injured, many of them. And so we begin to see changes, sometimes things that we would look at today and go, that's the wrong reason, or even that's the wrong solution. But these were reformers looking at society as they saw it at the time and trying to come up with a new way of viewing the world and new ways of dealing with the world. And there are a number of works of social criticism, Progress and Poverty by Henry George, and The Cooperative Commonwealth by Gronlund. These are 2 books that came out at this particular point that are right in line with this. We've got to figure out how to deal with the least of ours, because if we don't, then it will impact all of us. And as I said, this is really the beginning of what we refer to as the social gospel movement. There'll be a later variant in Catholicism that will lead to participation in many revolutions in Central and South America. But at this point, it's a strain in Protestantism, again, with mostly starts with these middle-class white women And again, as I said, these critique social Darwinism. They see the evils of the pure laissez-faire doctrine, let the market handle itself without any participation by the government. They also, at the time, will preach against the gospel of wealth. Now, the gospel of wealth, which we'll talk about again later, really has become the mainstream of American evangelical Protestantism. That's how Donald Trump, a serial abuser of women, a crook, all kinds of things that you would think that a good Christian wouldn't be able to support. They can, because God's smiling on him, because he's rich. That gospel of wealth, it will come and go, but it will really, it'll come back again in the 50s, and then again in the 80s, and then we see it again now. And so part of this social gospel movement looks at equalizing and eliminating those extremes of wealth and poverty to make competition fair, not lopsided, to help alleviate some of the working class conditions in the factories, in the homes, in the slums. Things like plumbing would be nice, right? Things like public parks so children don't have to play in the streets. And there really becomes a big push, and this is echoed in Europe, and Europe will actually go much farther with it. But there's a push to organize an economy around cooperation, that it should benefit all members of society, not just those at the very, very top. In 1886 is probably the most volatile year for labor in this country at this particular point. Knights of Labor had grown significantly. They hold the first May Day celebration, demonstration for the 8-hour day. We no longer celebrate May Day. Every other country in the world does, even though it originated here, but because it is dealing with workers' rights, labor, socialism, communism, the rest of the world celebrates it. We have Labor Day that we have kind of forgotten what it means. A few years ago on Labor Day, Fox News ran lists of all the women that were having babies, all the women that were quote-unquote in labor, because they didn't want to point out the fact that Labor Day is set to celebrate unions. That Labor Day is the day when we celebrate how you get the weekend, how you get the 8-hour day, how you get any benefits that you have when you're working, most of which are being whittled away because unions are diminishing in power right now. In Chicago, this ends up with huge strikes for over a year. Strikers are killed by police. A lot of bloodshed, and this will be normal for most labor protests, demonstrations, strikes, well up into the 1930s, where the police, the federal government, will send in troops. It'll send in soldiers. It'll send in the National Guard, and either go to work or die. And many people died to bring you the weekend, to bring you the 8-hour workday. And where they could generate violence, the government loved it, because it could then capitalize on the labor movement as being a vehicle of radical immigrants. This is another reason to fear immigrants. And as a violent movement of anarchists and people that are just not like you and me. Following the Haymarket Affair in Chicago, there were arrests, there was a trial. Many of the strikers who were arrested were convicted as being anarchists. They were hanged. Many of them spent life in prison. Some had their sentences commuted. There were a number of labor campaigns. In other words, independent people running for office that are often associated with the Knights of Labor. They often were kind of a single subject candidate, a single issue candidate. Henry George will actually run for mayor of New York on this. And it's really kind of the last big push of the Knights of Labor, is trying to really combine a political party with a union. And it doesn't go well, and there are a large number of, there are some people elected, not as many as they would have hoped at the time. And one of the reasons that the unions are so badly beaten up upon is that capital, and we need to really talk about the differences between capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism. We'll talk about that in a bit. But any type of labor organization, especially because of the final line of the Communist Manifesto, "Workers of the World Unite," which was later used by the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, as their motto, "Workers of the World Unite." And so there's this link in many people's heads between communism and the labor movement is seen as an issue. And this cartoon, from the period, you see the caterpillar of communism wanting to eat all of the lovely grapes of law and order and talent and industry and education and business and peace and all of this stuff. That if it weren't for that blanket, that leaf of capital protecting all of those things from communism, it would be able to break through and be able to destroy the world as we knew it. So these come from a film called Inequality for All, which I often show at the beginning of this class, in a face-to-face class, because it's a great historical overview of where we were and where we are. And so let's just compare. So here, these are more recent, but I'm trying to illustrate here that we live in a Gilded Age today. And so we saw the typical worker in 1978 made, in today's dollars, about $50,000. And the typical member of the 1%, that is actors, CEOs, the big money men, the stockbrokers, the wealthy, the 1%. That in 1978, for example, about just under 400,000. So 50,000, 400,000. There's a gap there, but it's not that huge. By 2010, the typical male worker was actually making less adjusted for inflation by almost $20,000. But the typical 1%er was earning an income well over $1 million. Now, the only thing that's changed in this is our tax policy and primarily our tax policy and our refusal to raise the minimum wage, to provide for workers, to provide a safety net stronger than the minimal one that we already have. And so we see this today where CEOs' salaries get higher and higher and higher, often seeing companies going bankrupt, but giving their senior management golden parachutes. Billions of dollars, millions of dollars are handed to CEOs of a business that's going out of business. How are you being rewarded for a company failing? And yet we see this on a regular basis today. Today, the top 400 richest people have more wealth than the bottom half of the American population. And it's getting worse. As of 2017, the Walton family, of which there are about 40 members, owned almost as much as the bottom half. So it is continuing to get worse. I just only have a slide for this particular date in 2010. And that pretty much wraps up America's Gilded Age, 1870 to 1890. The next time we talk, we will be talking about the Progressive Era, which is a direct result of what was going on in the Gilded Age. We will see the pendulum swing another direction.